Hello everyone. I welcome you all to this 6-day international e-workshop on contemporary critical trends in literature, and the topic of my presentation is emerging trends in eco-studies, which is going to be an introductory lecture on the emerging trends in eco-studies. In my presentation, I will make an attempt to present a brief overview of the history of development of eco-studies as a discipline, and also try to focus on the recent trends that are taking place in this field of study. For the purpose of the presentation, I have taken two novels, namely Soul Mountain by Cao Xing-jen, Chinese Nobel laureate in literature, and Nectar in a Sieve by noted Indian English writer Kamala Markandeya. I would provide an introduction to some of the most important tropes of eco-studies, and at the same time I would show how the same could be used in the interpretation of a literary text. Eco-studies or eco-criticism seeks to engage with a changing, troubled planet, helping to explain how we reached our current predicament, and attempts to provide a means of helping us to understand human nature better so that we can change ourselves and our lifestyles in order to sustain our existence and the lives of other species. Interdisciplinary in its approach, eco-criticism draws on the collaborative insights of histories, philosophers, writers, literary critics, life scientists, climatologists, geographers, cultural anthropologists, landscape artists, and even applied mathematics and environmental engineers. This field also undertakes a critical reconceptualization of dichotomies like nature and culture, self and other, the body and the mind, that have been in Western knowledge system since the Enlightenment. Eco-criticism calls for a paradigm shift from the human-centric to the biocentric. Just as feminist criticism examines language and literature from a gender-conscious perspective, and Marxist criticism brings an awareness of modes of production and economic class to its reading of text, eco-criticism takes an art-centered approach to literary studies. Ecological thinking about literature requires us to take the non-human world as seriously as previous modes of criticism have taken the human realm of society and culture. Literary theory in general examines the relations between writers, text, and the world. In most literary theory, the world is synonymous with society, the social sphere. Eco-criticism expands the notion of the world to include the entire ecosphere. Eco-criticism is an intentionally broad approach that is known by a number of other designations, including green studies, eco-poetics, eco-studies, and environmental literary criticism. Eco-criticism runs a whole gamut of definitions, the most well-known being the one Cheryl Grotfelty proposed in the Eco-criticism Reader, that is, the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. Eco-critics ask questions such as, how is nature presented in the novel, poem, play? Secondly, what role does the physical geographical setting play in the structure of the novel? Thirdly, how do our metaphors of the land influence the way we treat it? That is, what is the link between pedagogic or creative practice, and actual political, socio-cultural, and ethical behavior towards the land and other non-life forms. And we may also include questions like, how is science in the form of genetic engineering, technologies, or reproduction, sexualities open to critical scrutiny, terms of the effects of science upon the land. Lawrence Buell provides a checklist of ingredients that constitute an environmentally oriented work of literature. He says the non-human environment is present not merely as a framing device but as a presence that begins to suggest that human history is implied in natural history. Secondly, the human interest is not understood to be the only legitimate interest. Human accountability to the environment is part of the text ethical orientation. And finally, some sense of the environment as a process rather than as a constant or a given is at least implicit in the text. This is from his book, The Environmental Imagination. Again, Scott Slovic, noted eco-critic, he states that, I quote, "Eco-critics should tell stories, should use narrative as a constant or intermittent strategy for literary analysis to illuminate and appreciate the context of reading, that is, to embrace the literary text as language that somehow contributes to our lives out in the world." Richard Carries suggests that the eco-critic should track environmental ideas and address debates wherever they appear in a partially concealed cultural spaces and evaluate text and ideas in terms of their coherence and usefulness as responses to the environmental crisis. Dana Phillips, in his book The Truth of Ecology, states that there are writers and eco-critics who articulate a symbiotic relationship between the text and the terrain and argue that language is not specific from the world of nature. According to Gary Snyder, literature perennially redefines our place in the cosmos, since it is born out of the deep experience of participating in the wave of interconnections. William Record applies ecological concepts to the study of literature, arguing the need for poems to be studied as, I quote, "models for energy flow, community building, and ecosystems," unquote. The term eco-criticism was first used by Record in his essay Literature and Ecology, an experiment in eco-criticism, in the year 1978. Michael P. Branch refers to eco-criticism as a call for cultural change, which is not merely an exercise in analyzing nature in literature, but a move towards a more biocentric worldview, an extension of ethics, a broadening of humans' conception of global community to include non-human life forms and the physical environment. Joseph Meeker, in his seminal work, The Comedy of Survival, Studies in Literary Ecology, affirms that as the world's only literary creatures, human beings have the responsibility to discover the role of literature in the welfare and survival of humanity and the natural environment, as well as to examine the insight it offers into human relationships with other species and with the world around us. An important landmark in the history of eco-criticism was the founding of ASLE, that is Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, in the United States in 1992. Many concepts of contemporary environmental thinking can be traced to key texts belonging to the Romantic period. To the Romantics, nature provided a route to self-realization and the repository of health, beauty, and moral perfection. Romanticism emerged as a critique of the Enlightenment tradition, which was influenced by Francis Bacon's empiricism, Isaac Newton's physics, and René Descartes' conceptualization of a universe where thinking subjects were radically separate from inert nature. The Enlightenment constructed the dichotomies of culture and nature in order to establish mastery over nature. English eco-critics believe that their legacy goes back to John Ruskin's Modern Painters, Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads. The writings of Wordsworth, Coleridge, John Clare, Edward Carpenter, William Morris helped inspire the establishment of an array of environmental societies in the late 19th century who wished to turn England from the grimy backyard of industrialization into a garden. Lawrence Buell describes the first two waves of eco-criticism in his book, The Future of Environmental Criticism, published in 2005. For the first wave eco-criticism, environment effectively meant natural environment. It was in the early 1990s that the first wave of eco-criticism proper was launched. It focused on literary non-fiction, the representation of non-human nature and wilderness in British and American literature, and argued for the protection and preservation of the natural environment from marauding humans. Second wave eco-criticism has tended to question organicist models of conceiving both environment and environmentalism. Literature and environment studies must develop a social eco-criticism that takes urban and degraded landscapes just as seriously as natural landscape, in addition to wilderness and rural scapes. Second wave eco-criticism has so far concentrated strongly, for example, on locating vestiges of nature within cities or exposing crimes of injustice against society's marginal groups. Eco-criticism exhibits a spectrum of ethical standpoints, including biocentric, anthropocentric, and many in-between positions that environmental ethics share, and a common concern with eco-criticism, namely developing a critical awareness of human attitudes that deplete and pollute the earth. Aldo Leopold is one of the key figures of American environmental movement. His idea of the land ethic argues in favor of a radical shift in the way humans relate to nature. It changes the role of Homo sapiens from conquerors of the land to plain member and citizen of it. Land ethic enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. Aldo Leopold's biocentric ethics suggested the concept of a living, interrelated art which anticipated influential theories like the Gaia hypothesis, named after Gaia, the Greek goddess of the art. The Gaia hypothesis, formulated by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis in the 1970s, proposes that the art is a complex, sentient, self-regulating system in which all organisms and their inorganic surroundings are closely coupled to maintain optimum conditions necessary for life. Arne Naess introduced the term deep ecology in a 1973 article where he distinguished the deep ecological view from the mainstream shallow environmentalism, which is anthropocentric. Deep ecology, on the contrary, foster deep affinities and help individuals to see themselves as part of the art family, thereby enabling them to act on behalf of the art. The key positive claim put forward by deep ecologists is that the well-being and flourishing of human and non-human life on art have intrinsic value in themselves, and these values are independent of the usefulness of the non-human world for human purposes. The shift from a human-centered to a nature-centered system of values is the core of the radicalism attributed to deep ecology, bringing it into opposition with almost the entirety of Western philosophy and religion. Distinctive deep ecological attitudes, values is organically related and inextricably linked with the significance of the title Soul Mountain. The original title of the novel is Ling Shan, which means Ling Shan is a Chinese word where Ling meaning spirit or soul and Shan meaning mountain in Chinese. Gao Xingzhen's novel Soul Mountain is a fictionalized autobiography superimposed upon a documentation of his 5-month journey through the Chinese hinterland from July to November in 1983. The journey in Soul Mountain begins by leaving the contaminated surroundings and searching for an authentic life in nature. The impersonal city life sets the narrator off on a journey to the forest and the mountains in rural areas where the primitive practices of living an original life are still preserved and minimally contaminated by modern civilization. Soul Mountain is based on the Taoist doctrine yin yang, that everything is made in the world is made up of these opposing but related forces. Yin is the female force and yang is the male force. According to Taoist tradition, everything consists of this balance. It is what constitutes reality. The universe is a single vital organism, not created according to some fixed principle, but spontaneously regenerating from the primal energy lodged within all organic forms of life. Soul Mountain presents an intrinsically dynamic, interconnected web of relations in which there are no absolutely discrete entities and no absolute dividing lines between the living and the non-living, the animate and the inanimate, or the human and the non-human. The text articulates the symbiotic relationship between land and landscape, text and terrain, and recognizes that man is not separate from the world of nature. The ecosystem thus represented, calls us to examine the very nature of the human place in the natural world. Greta Gard, in her essay New Directions for Ecofeminism Towards a More Feminist Eco-Criticism, where she announces the emergence of feminist eco-criticism and notes that, I quote, the intersectional analysis of nature, gender, race, class, species and sexuality is not confined to an essentialist definition of feminism or ecofeminism, but rather offers a strategic conceptual approach towards bringing about the social justice, economic and ecological democracy needed to solve environmental crisis in the present moment. Unquote. Ecofeminism is a pluralistic movement and embraces a number of causes. Greta Gard succinctly defines it as a movement that calls for an end to all oppressions, arguing that no attempt to liberate women will be successful without an equal attempt to liberate nature. Vandana Shiva is emphatic about how the marginalization of women and the loss of biodiversity go hand in hand, and believes that women are subsistence workers and the natural custodians of indigenous art, wisdom that has been passed down orally from generation to generation. Vandana Shiva, in her Staying Alive, discussed nature as feminine, Prakriti, which is an expression of Shakti, the feminine and creative principle of the cosmos. Uniting with the masculine, Purusha, Prakriti creates the world. Shiva argues that the feminine principle must resist the Western concept of male development. She views male development as a paradigm that sees all work that doesn't produce profit and capital as non-productive work. This practice violates the integrity and harmony of man in nature and the harmony between men and women. She further argues that women and nature as the other, the passive non-self. While protesting the Western concept, she wants to promote a holistic approach which will help to look at the nature as a creative force. This creative force is a feminine based force which is based on Hindu concept of Prakriti or life force. Kamala Markande's first novel, Nectar in a Sieve, deals with the predicament of women, basically of the working class. Being a women writer, she portrays the women characters as such, how they tried to find their identity in a male-dominated society. Nectar in a Sieve portrays the character of Rukmani from the point of liberal ecofeminist who believes that women have the power to conserve the natural resources. The novel can be interpreted from an ecofeminist perspective. Through this tool of eco-criticism, we can examine the relationship between nature and women. The environmentalist Vandana Shiva's idea of nature as feminine is reflected in the writings of Markandeya. In the novel, Markandeya presents the natural imagery in a very significant manner. She considers nature as both preserver and destroyer. In the novel, she shows how the environment is deteriorated by the coming of industries. The novel also reflects the advent of tannery in the village of Nathan and Rukmani and how this tannery affects the environment of the village. Geography has always been involved in the analysis of place, and this provides the first core concept. Lawrence Boyle argues that environmental literature constructs places in a particular way, not just by naming objects, but by dramatizing in the process how they matter. Place attachment thus becomes a resource in the articulation of environmental unconsciousness. Place, like environment, encompasses human perceptions and aspirations, as well as the biophysical characteristics that can be measured and monitored. The shape of the earth's surface and the processes enacted upon it, both physical and human, are part of the essence of geography. Contemporary geographers such as E. Fu Tuan and Edward Ralph have highlighted the importance of place and geographical awareness, and of the role of humans as geographical awareness, and of the role of humans as geographical agents who have the power to transform the earth. Hence, the discourse of living in place includes key terms such as bioregion, dwelling, and others. A bioregion is literally and etymologically a life place, a unique region definable by natural boundaries with geographic, climatic, hydrological, and ecological character, capable of supporting unique human and non-human living communities. Peter Berg and Raymond Dashman use the term bioregionalism in a nuanced manner by extending its meaning to a terrain of consciousness in addition to the geographical terrain. In the introduction to the book, The Bioregional Imagination, Literature, Ecology and Place, the editors argue that human imagination and stories create bioregions, that every bioregion is already filled with stories and modes of discourse of the values and practices that ordinary people who live in those places embrace. E. O. Wilson also refers to the term called biophilia, that is, the feeling of oneness with all life forms, and what E. Fu Tuan defines as topophilia, that is, the effective bond between people and place or setting. Urban eco-criticism, which is a second wave phenomenon, includes cities and their complex ecosystems and is crucial to the understanding of the modern human mind as something that is constituted by urban forms and dwelling. It celebrates the diversity of cities and pays more attention to the flora, fauna, and geographical characteristics that shapes urban life. Regarding theories of postmodern spatiality as evident in the works of Henry Lefebvre, Edward Soja, David Harvey, and other theorists have revealed cartographic configuration of place and space, the real and the imagined spaces. Engaging with the complex dialectic of space-place relationships, studying the material base of the relationship between humans and their lived environments, examining the environmental effects of industrialization on human habitats, and realigning the local with the global are some of the challenges that urban eco-criticism takes up. Place, landscape, and space are clearly highly interrelated terms, and each definition is contested. The French urban theorist Henry Lefebvre has produced a much more sophisticated account of space, in which he distinguishes between more abstract kinds of space, both lived and meaningful spaces. Place is how we make the world meaningful and the way we experience the world. Place at the basic level is space invested with meaning in the context of power. Tuan argued that through human perceptions and experience, we get to know the world through places. The term topophilia was developed by Tuan to refer to the effective bond between people and place. Place has a physical form, that is landscape. Landscape is often understood as a panoramic view or a scenery. Landscape is always a kind of scentscape. Edward S. Casey points out the fact that, unlike places, landscapes are seldom named. What makes the experience of place different from that of landscape is the concept of time and the act of memory associated with the former. A sense of place is caught up in a landscape, be it natural or urban. A term called non-places, developed by French anthropologist Marc Oz in his book Non-Places, refers to liminal spaces such as airports, railway stations, fast food outlets, malls, supermarkets, hotels and other transient places which cannot be categorized as either relational or historical or concerned with identity formation. These are the spaces of consumption, products of acceleration of time and shrinkage of space in the age of supermodernity. These are spaces that seldom detached from the local environment and tell us nothing about the particular locality in which they are located. Gao Xingjian's novel Soul Mountain seeks to bring out a better understanding of the intertwining aspects of place, landscape, memory and spaces in ethnographic representations. The novel makes a strong connection between the places the narrator visited on his journey and the entrenched Chinese cultural traditions behind the landscape. Land is always read like a text with literary and cultural meaning embedded by the narrator in his search for cultural memories. The landscape in Soul Mountain provides a contextual horizon of perceptions, providing both a foreground and a background in which people feel themselves to be living in their world. Soul Mountain also stresses on the notion that the folk tales, oral histories, ethnography, ballads and ordinary events of daily life all invoked in the spatial positioning of a place. The novel presents a lively vision of the customs, folk songs and traditions preserved by the national minorities. These songs provide valuable insights into understanding the ethnoecology, a term developed by McLaren of the region. It is defined as a traditional set of environmental perceptions, cultural model of the environment and its relation to people and society. It might be countered that at a time when there is allegedly no place on earth that has not been affected in some way by humanity's alteration of the natural environment, the precedence of nature has now become questionable. It is, however, precisely the imperilment of the biosphere wrought by that alteration which impels the eco-critical reinstatement of the referent as a matter of legitimate concern. For the eco-critic, it is vital to be able to say what Kat Soper that, I quote, "It is not language that has a hole in its ozone layer, and the real thing continues to be polluted and degraded even as we refine our deconstructive insights at the level of the signifier." Unquote. Scott Slovic reminds us, citing Walt Whitman, eco-criticism is large and contains multitudes. Eco-critics are increasingly many and varied, drawing on a range of analytical strategies and theoretical approaches, and addresses a diversity of cultural phenomena from Shakespearean drama to wildlife documentaries, romantic pastoral to sci-fi eco-thrillers. Eco-criticism's interdisciplinary dialogue have enabled new theoretical frameworks and trajectories that interrogate and redefine the boundaries of the human in the Anthropocene. Changing paradigms in the field have served as a fusion chamber for a plethora of new discourses in the field of environmental humanities, such as material eco-criticism, queer eco-criticism, post-human eco-criticism, and others. Environmental criticism in literature and the arts clearly does not yet have the standing within the academy of such other issue-driven discourses as those of race, gender, sexuality, class, and globalization. Most of the time, we are approaching eco-criticism from Western lineage, especially the canonical green critical works from the US and the UK, and attempt to arrive at a comprehensive eco-critical theory. In Indian concept, there is no separate existence for man apart from nature. Man and nature are not radically different entities in Indian thought. It is much relevant a debate about on so a serious topic in the context of environmental crisis. Hence, there is a need for the exploration of indigenous varieties of eco-criticism like the environmental tradition, so as to engage in a cross-cultural dialogue with the Western counterparts. So, we should try to bring about a kind of comparative study between Indian Vedantic philosophy, Buddhist ecosophy, or the Chinese Taoist tradition, so that we can start a dialogue with the Western counterparts. Finally, I would like to conclude my presentation with a quotation from the novel Soul Mountain by Kao Sing-jen, in which the narrator says, I quote, "Man follows art, art follows sky, sky follows the way follows nature." He proclaims loudly, "Don't commit actions which go against the basic character of nature. Don't commit acts which should not be committed." Unquote. Thank you. And if you have any questions, then I'll be happy to answer your queries. Thank you very much.